For more than 3,000 years, a population from one forgotten corner of West Africa has been quietly shaping the DNA of hundreds of millions of people across the continent, people living thousands of miles away who have never even heard of the place their ancestors came from. The trail begins near the modern Nigeria-Cameroon border, and what scientists found there changes the story of African ancestry completely. Because the population responsible for one of Africa's greatest migrations was not the Yoruba, it was not the Igbo. It was a much smaller ancient population whose descendants eventually spread across nearly 30 countries, carrying their genes and languages into Central, Eastern, and Southern Africa. And here is the part nobody expects. The genetic connection is still detectable in people alive today. So how did a relatively small population trigger one of the largest demographic expansions in human history, and why did almost no one realize where it began? Stay with me, because the answer begins with DNA buried in one of the most overlooked regions of Nigeria. Start with the basic ethnic landscape, because the numbers alone tell you something important before any DNA gets sequenced at all. Nigeria's three largest ethnic groups, the Yoruba in the southwest, the Igbo in the southeast, and the Hausa Fulani in the north, together account for roughly 2/3 of the country's population, with dozens of smaller groups, the Ibibio, the Tiv, the Ija, the Kanuri, the Nupe, and many others, filling out the remaining third. These aren't recently invented political categories. The Yoruba trace their cultural and spiritual origins to the ancient city of Ile-Ife, associated with a founding figure named Oduduwa in their oral tradition, and archaeological evidence from sites like Igbo Ukwu, dating back to the 9th century CE, documents sophisticated bronze-working societies in southeastern Nigeria, centuries before any European contact with the region. These are old, deeply rooted, independently developed civilizations that happen to end up inside the same colonial-era borders when Nigeria was created as a political entity in the 20th century. Genetic research confirms that this deep cultural separation runs straight through the DNA as well, not just through language and tradition. A detailed 2024 study published in Scientific Reports examined Y chromosome and mitochondrial DNA data from Yoruba, Igbo, and Hausa populations specifically, and found statistically significant genetic differences between all three groups, differences strong enough to reliably distinguish one population from another using genetic markers alone. Interestingly, the study found something more specific buried inside that broader pattern. The difference showed up much more clearly on the paternal side, traced through the Y chromosome, than on the maternal side, traced through mitochondrial DNA. Yoruba and Igbo populations, both belonging to the same broader Niger-Congo language family, showed paternal genetic correlation with other populations sharing that same linguistic background, while their maternal lineages looked considerably more similar to each other and to the Hausa population than the paternal data would have predicted. Researchers connected that specific pattern to something called patrilocality, a social system common across much of West Africa in which women traditionally moved to join their husband's community after marriage, while men generally stayed rooted in the community they were born into for their entire lives. Over many centuries, that social pattern produces exactly the genetic signature researchers found: paternal lineages staying relatively distinct and geographically anchored to specific ethnic and linguistic communities, while maternal lineages gradually blend and mix more freely across those same community boundaries, carried along by generation after generation of women moving into new households and new communities through marriage. It's a subtle technical finding, but it reveals something genuinely important about how Nigeria's ethnic diversity actually formed and persisted over time, layered underneath the more visible, more commonly discussed differences in language and culture. Think about what that pattern means for how these communities actually preserved their distinct identities across so many centuries of shared geography and, in many cases, shared trade, a shared religious contact, and even occasional intermarriage. If maternal lineages were blending more freely than paternal ones, it means the paternal line functioned as the primary anchor of ethnic and linguistic continuity, generation after generation, even as individual communities absorbed women and whatever cultural and biological influence those women carried from neighboring populations. That's a genuinely different mechanism for maintaining ethnic distinctiveness than the more commonly discussed model of strict, comprehensive endogamy, marrying entirely within one's own group on both sides. And it helps explain why Nigeria's ethnic groups remain so linguistically and culturally distinct, even in regions where different communities lived in close, sustained contact with one another for centuries. That 2024 study, detailed as it was, only scratched the surface of the genetic complexity researchers have since uncovered across Nigeria as a whole. A considerably larger and more ambitious project, published in 2023, sequenced whole genomes from 449 individuals spanning 47 separate ethnolinguistic groups across the country, by far the most comprehensive genetic survey of Nigerian population diversity ever assembled. The results confirmed what smaller studies had already hinted at, and added real, striking new detail on top. Yoruba, Isan, Igbo, Ibibio, Bini, and Izon populations, spread across Nigeria's southwestern, south-south, and southeastern regions, showed broadly similar underlying genetic ancestry to one another, forming one recognizable genetic supergroup despite speaking different languages and maintaining distinct cultural identities. But other groups included in the same study, including the Nupe, Ham, and Atiap populations from Nigeria's central states, showed a genuinely different genetic profile, distinct enough to form their own separate cluster entirely. A third distinguishable cluster emerged from groups including the Waja, Tangale, Burapabir, and Tera populations concentrated in Nigeria's north-central and northeastern regions. In the far north, among Chadic-speaking populations along the Cameroon border, the researchers found something even more specific and, in its own way, genuinely remarkable. A datable admixture event, a moment in history where two or more previously separate ancestral populations mixed together and left a detectable genetic signature that the researchers were able to pin down to approximately the year 710 CE, with a confidence range stretching from roughly 10 BCE to 840 CE. That timing lines up with a historically documented period of increased contact and interaction between Fulani, Hausa, and other Chadic-speaking populations across northern Nigeria and Cameroon, a demographic pattern that continued shaping the region for centuries afterward and eventually culminated in the 19th century Fulani Jihad, led by Usman Dan Fodio, which established the enormous multi-ethnic Sokoto Caliphate across much of what is now northern Nigeria. Genetics, in this specific case, managed to date a population mixing event using nothing but DNA extracted from living descendants, and the date it produced landed squarely within a period historians had already independently documented through written and oral historical records, two completely separate lines of evidence converging on the same rough time frame without either one having been designed to confirm the other. The Hausa Fulani population specifically carries its own distinct genetic signature worth examining on its own terms, separate from the broader north-south divide running through the rest of the country. Centuries of trans-Saharan trade, combined with the Islamic expansion that reached northern Nigeria beginning around the 11th century, left a measurable genetic trace connecting Hausa Fulani populations to North African and Middle Eastern ancestry, a signal essentially absent from the Yoruba and Igbo populations further south. Consumer genetic testing data collected from thousands of Nigerian customers over the past decade has consistently reinforced this same Regional split. Yoruba individuals typically show elevated genetic signal connecting to the Benin and Togo region immediately to their west. Igbo individuals typically show elevated signal connecting toward Cameroon and the broader Congo basin to their southeast, while Fulani individuals typically show a distinct signal connecting towards Senegal and the wider Sahel region, a genetic fingerprint essentially unique to that specific population within Nigeria's broader ethnic landscape. The Fulani case is worth lingering on a moment longer because it represents one of the more genuinely unusual population histories anywhere in West Africa. Unlike the Yoruba and Igbo, whose ancestors developed largely in place across many centuries within their respective home regions, the Fulani have historically been an unusually mobile, widely dispersed pastoralist population, with related Fulani communities found scattered across a huge stretch of the Sahel, from Senegal in the far west through Mali, Niger, and Nigeria, and onward into Cameroon, Chad, and Sudan further east. That geographic spread across so many different modern countries, maintained alongside a shared cultural and pastoralist identity, has left the Fulani carrying a genuinely distinct genetic profile among Nigeria's major ethnic groups, one shaped by centuries of long-distance mobility across the Sahel, rather than by settlement and development within one single fixed home region, the way Yoruba and Igbo history largely unfolded. All of that regional complexity, genuinely significant on its own, still isn't the most dramatic part of this story. The most dramatic part involves a stretch of land straddling the modern border between Nigeria and Cameroon, an area linguists and geneticists refer to simply as the Bantu homeland, and what happened there somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 years ago. Bantu languages today are spoken by more people across Africa than any other language family on the continent, somewhere in the range of 350 million speakers scattered across roughly 30 different countries, stretching from Cameroon in the west all the way to Kenya in the east, and down through Tanzania, Zambia, Zimbabwe, and South Africa in the south. Zulu speakers in South Africa, Swahili speakers along the East African coast, Congo speakers in Central Africa, Shona speakers in Zimbabwe, dozens upon dozens of distinct ethnic and linguistic groups spread across an enormous share of the entire African continent, all speaking languages that trace back linguistically to a single common ancestral tongue. That ancestral homeland, according to overwhelming consensus among linguists, archaeologists, and geneticists, working independently across multiple decades of research, sits in exactly one place: the borderlands between Nigeria and the grassfields region of Cameroon. Sit with the scale of that for a moment. A relatively small population living in a specific geographically limited region straddling the modern Nigeria-Cameroon border sometime between 3,000 and 5,000 years ago, eventually gave rise through a long, gradual, multi-wave migration process to hundreds of millions of people's ancestry spread across nearly a third of the entire African continent. Genetic research examining Y chromosome data specifically has worked to trace the exact routes this expansion followed, identifying evidence for what researchers describe as separate western and eastern migration branches, along with a distinct later-stage eastern expansion phase, each wave carrying descendants of that original Nigeria-Cameroon borderland population further and further across the continent, generation after generation, over the course of roughly 3,000 years. To put that timeline in perspective, this migration was already well underway before the founding of most of the ancient civilizations more commonly taught in world history classes. It predates the height of ancient Egypt's New Kingdom. It predates the founding of Rome by over 1,000 years. It was already spreading across Central Africa, while the events described in some of humanity's oldest surviving written texts were still unfolding elsewhere in the world. And unlike those more famous ancient civilizations, which left behind monumental architecture, written records, and easily datable archaeological sites, the Bantu expansion left behind something considerably harder to trace directly: a slow, generational spread of language, agricultural technique, and eventually ironworking technology, carried forward primarily by ordinary families moving gradually into new territory over the course of many human lifetimes, with genetics now serving as one of the only tools capable of reconstructing the full scope of what actually happened. A major genome-wide study published examining the genetic legacy of this expansion in detail found that Bantu-speaking populations today, despite being scattered across dramatically different climates, ecosystems, and neighboring populations from West Africa to Southern Africa, still carry a detectable, traceable genetic signature connecting them back to that original homeland population, layered on top of substantial admixture with the different genetically distinct populations they encountered and intermarried with along the way as the expansion spread. Southern African Bantu-speaking populations specifically show genetic evidence of significant admixture with the region's original Khoisan-speaking inhabitants, populations who had lived across southern Africa for tens of thousands of years before Bantu-speaking migrants ever arrived. East African Bantu-speaking populations show their own distinct admixture patterns, connecting to Nilo-Saharan and Cushitic-speaking populations native to that region. Every branch of the expansion picked up its own specific genetic additions as it spread, while still carrying that original Nigeria-Cameroon borderland ancestry as a detectable, shared thread running underneath all of that later regional diversity. That layering effect is exactly what makes this particular migration story so genuinely useful as a case study in how population genetics actually works. A Zulu person in modern South Africa and an Igbo person in modern Nigeria share almost no recent common ancestry in any meaningful everyday sense, shaped by entirely separate histories, entirely separate cultures, and, in the Zulu case, substantial genetic input from southern African populations who had lived on that land for tens of thousands of years before any Bantu-speaking migrants ever arrived, and yet trace the genetic threads back far enough, 3,000 to 5,000 years rather than 3 to 5 generations, and a real, measurable connection to that same small ancestral homeland region does emerge, a connection invisible in day-to-day cultural or linguistic terms, but fully readable inside the genome itself. Here's where the story becomes genuinely strange to sit with, though, and it's the detail that makes the title of this whole investigation actually make sense. The Yoruba and Igbo, Nigeria's two largest and most internationally recognized ethnic groups, are not Bantu-speaking populations, and their ancestors were not the specific population responsible for the Bantu expansion. Both languages belong to the broader Niger-Congo language family, the same enormous linguistic family that Bantu languages themselves ultimately descend from. But Yoruba and Igbo represent separate, independently developed branches of that family tree, not direct descendants of the specific Bantu homeland population. The actual ancestral Bantu-speaking population lived specifically in the Grassfields region, straddling Nigeria's eastern border with Cameroon, a comparatively small area geographically distinct from the Yoruba heartland around Ile-Ife in the southwest or the Igbo heartland in the southeast. So the population most directly responsible for seeding the ancestry of hundreds of millions of Bantu-speaking Africans across an enormous swath of the continent wasn't the Yoruba and wasn't the Igbo, the two ethnic groups most commonly associated with Nigeria in international popular awareness. It was a comparatively obscure population from Nigeria's eastern borderlands, a group whose modern-day linguistic and cultural descendants remain a relatively small, specific community within Nigeria's own borders today, even as the broader genetic and linguistic legacy of their ancient ancestors' migration touches the ancestry of a genuinely staggering share of the entire African continent's modern population. That's a genuinely disorienting thing to fully absorb. Millions of Zulu people in South Africa, thousands of miles from Nigeria, speaking a language completely unintelligible to modern Yoruba or Igbo speakers, living in a climate and landscape nothing like the Nigerian rainforest their ancestors' migration originated from, carry a genetic and linguistic thread, tracing back to essentially the same small corner of West Africa that most people, if asked to name Nigeria's most historically significant ethnic populations, would never think to mention at all. The ethnic groups that get the most international attention when people discuss Nigeria today. The Yoruba, with their globally influential Afro-beats music and Nollywood film industry. The Igbo, with their prominent diaspora communities across the United States and United Kingdom, aren't the specific lineage responsible for this particular continent-spanning migration legacy. A different, comparatively lower-profile population from Nigeria's eastern border region holds that distinction instead. Try running the comparison the other direction too, and the scale becomes even harder to fully process. If you lined up every person alive today whose ancestry traces back through the Bantu expansion, spanning South Africa's Zulu and Xhosa populations, Kenya's coastal Swahili communities, Zimbabwe's Shona majority, and dozens of other groups across 30 countries, and compared that total figure against the combined populations of every country in Western Europe put together, the Bantu-descended population would likely come out ahead. A migration that began in a specific, comparatively small stretch of borderland between two modern countries produced, over the following 3,000 to 5,000 years, a demographic legacy on the scale of an entire European continent's worth of people, spread across a landmass considerably larger than Europe itself. None of this diminishes the Yoruba or Igbo's own genuinely significant, independently documented histories, which stand entirely on their own merits, regardless of any connection or lack of connection to the Bantu expansion. The Yoruba built one of pre-colonial Africa's most sophisticated urban civilizations, centered on Ile-Ife, and later expanding into the powerful Oyo Empire, with a documented tradition of bronze and terracotta artistry, recognized as among the finest produced anywhere in the pre-colonial world. The Igbo developed their own distinct, historically significant civilization centered on sites like Igbo Ukwu, with archaeological evidence of sophisticated metalworking, and long-distance trade networks reaching back over 1,000 years, organized around a notably decentralized democratic political structure that stood in genuine contrast to the more centralized kingdoms found elsewhere in the region. Both histories are real, well-documented, and significantly entirely independent of the Bantu expansion story. They simply represent a separate, parallel thread of Nigerian and West African history, running alongside rather than through the specific migration that seeded so much of the rest of the continent's population. It's worth being precise about what this comparison does and doesn't establish, because it would be easy to misread it as somehow ranking these different Nigerian populations against each other, as though genetic legacy and historical significance were the same measurement. They aren't. A population's genetic footprint across the modern world says nothing about the sophistication, achievement, or historical importance of that population's own independent civilization. The Bantu homeland population's descendants happen to migrate outward across an enormous, sparsely populated landscape over several millennia, spreading their genetic and linguistic legacy across a vast geographic area in the process. The Yoruba and Igbo, by contrast, largely stayed rooted in their own specific regions, building increasingly dense, increasingly sophisticated societies in place, rather than dispersing outward, a fundamentally different historical trajectory that happened to leave a fundamentally different kind of genetic footprint, concentrated rather than scattered without that concentration making their own civilizational achievements any less significant. What emerges from putting all of this research together, the deep ethnic and linguistic divisions separating Yoruba, Igbo, and Hausa Fulani populations. The datable admixture events connecting northern Nigerian populations to broader trans-Saharan and Sahelian history, the patrilocal marriage patterns that shaped paternal versus maternal genetic diversity differently across the country, and the entirely separate, genuinely enormous legacy of the Bantu expansion originating from Nigeria's eastern borderlands is a picture of Nigerian ancestry considerably more layered and consequential than the simple national label Nigerian could ever fully capture on its own. Nigeria isn't one genetic population wearing one national identity. It's several genuinely distinct ancestral populations, shaped by their own separate histories of migration, trade, and settlement, sharing a single set of colonial-era borders, one of which happens to have launched a demographic and linguistic legacy stretching across nearly a third of the entire African continent, while the others built their own equally significant, equally independent civilizations entirely within Nigeria's own borders. That's the genuinely important correction buried inside this whole investigation. The popular international image of Nigeria, shaped heavily by Yoruba and Igbo cultural influence through music, film, literature, and diaspora communities scattered across the world, captures real and significant history, but it captures only part of a considerably larger, more geographically consequential genetic story. Somewhere in the borderlands, most casual observers of Nigerian history and culture have never even heard mentioned. A comparatively small ancient population set in motion a migration that would eventually touch the ancestry of hundreds of millions of people, reshaping the linguistic and genetic landscape of an entire continent, centuries before anyone involved had any concept of Nigeria as a nation or any way of knowing just how far their descendants' journey would eventually carry them. There is a broader lesson embedded in this specific Nigerian case that extends well beyond the country's own borders, too. National identity, as a modern political category, is a genuinely recent invention, layered on top of population histories that, in nearly every part of the world, stretch back thousands of years longer than the nations currently claiming them. Nigeria's borders were drawn by colonial administrators in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, grouping together populations with genuinely separate, independently ancient histories under a single political label, largely for administrative convenience rather than any underlying shared ancestry. That's not a uniquely Nigerian situation. It's the standard pattern for the overwhelming majority of modern nations worldwide, each one containing genetic and historical complexity that national identity, by its very nature, tends to flatten into something simpler and more unified than the underlying reality actually supports. If a story like this, where the population responsible for one of history's largest demographic expansions turns out to be a comparatively obscure group most people have never heard of, rather than the more famous populations that share its modern national borders, is the kind that stays with you. This exact pattern shows up again and again across population genetics research all over the world, the biggest genetic legacies frequently traced back to populations history books never bothered to make famous. And if there's a specific population, region, or ancestry mystery you've always wanted properly examined against the real evidence, drop it below, because that's exactly where the next one of these comes from.